They called her a paper soldier the second she walked in. The kind of soldier who spends more time on a desk than on the battlefield. The kind of soldier who probably fought more keyboards than enemies. They laughed, their voices thick with arrogance, making jokes about her being the type who could only file reports and push pens. But all that changed when the tape on her wrists slipped, and one by one, the marks beneath it were revealed. 9 of them. 9 burn marks that weren't tattoos. 9 marks that weren't just for decoration. They represented something far darker, far more real than they ever could have imagined. The room fell into an eerie silence as the soldiers realized something. She wasn't just another name. She wasn't the quiet desk jockey they assumed. She wasn't the paper soldier they laughed at. What they saw beneath the fabric wasn't a symbol of weakness. It was a mark of survival, of sacrifice, and of experiences that could never be told in a file. Those weren't just marks. They were the scars of real, brutal combat. Each one told a story that none of them could fathom in their worst nightmares. As the men stood frozen, the woman didn't look for validation, nor did she feel the need to prove anything. She wasn't trying to show off. She wasn't here for attention. She had earned those marks in places they couldn't even name. Places where lives were lost, and survival was the only thing that mattered. It was a harsh reminder that not everything could be seen on the surface. The 3 cocky reservists, Spence, Toiver, and Darren, who had been quick to judge, now stood in stunned silence. The harsh reality set in. These marks weren't just part of her story. They were the reason their rotation even existed. The reason they still had the privilege of standing there in the gym. The reality of her past was one they had completely misjudged. And now, they were about to learn the hardest lesson of their military careers. Want to know what those marks really meant? And why those 3 men would never forget the moment they learned who Sergeant Briggs truly was? Hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Let's begin. The sun hadn't fully cleared the fence line when Sergeant Lorna Briggs pushed through the double doors of Building 9, stepping into the gym at Fort Brennan. The sharp smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with the lingering scent of old sweat. A peculiar cocktail that had become synonymous with military fitness centers. It was a smell that hung in the air like a constant reminder of the balance between ambition and regulation. The perfect blend of striving for strength while adhering to the rigid structure of military life. Briggs moved through the gym with the kind of quiet precision that spoke volumes about her. At 42, she was no longer the young recruit brimming with energy and raw enthusiasm. The years had taught her to move with purpose, to conserve every ounce of energy until it was needed. Her ponytail was pulled tight, the faded army cap sitting low on her head, almost as if she were trying to blend in with the walls. But nothing about her presence was quiet. Nothing about her was invisible. Her shirt, once bright with military insignia, had seen its fair share of wear, washed so many times that the fabric had softened and lost the logo that marked her rank. Her boots weren't regulation shiny, but they were well-worn, molded to her feet after years of traversing terrains that didn't appear on any training manual. The soles of those boots had borne the weight of countless miles, of experiences far beyond the confines of this gym. Unlike most of the weekend warriors who filtered in and out of the gym with an air of self-importance, Briggs carried no swagger. No need to announce her presence. She walked with the confidence of someone who had long ago learned that it wasn't the loudest person in the room who commanded respect. It was the one who knew when to stay silent and when to act. Behind the front desk, Corporal Martinez barely looked up as Briggs approached, absorbed in his digital roster. His fingers moved across the tablet screen with practiced indifference, a soldier on autopilot. But when her name appeared on the screen, he hesitated, the familiarity of it pulling at something in his memory. He glanced up unsure, his voice low but tinged with uncertainty. "You on the sparring roster?" Briggs nodded. Was told I was cleared for it. Her calm response didn't match the skepticism in Martinez's eyes, but it was clear. She wasn't here to explain herself. She was here to prove something entirely different. As Briggs moved further into the gym, the sounds of weights clanking and machines humming filled the air. It was a typical morning, the kind where soldiers came in to work off their stress, pushing themselves through routines that hardly ever mimicked the real world they'd signed up to serve. In the far corner, 3 reservists stood near the weight bench, engaged in casual conversation that carried across the gym with ease. Their laughter was loud, brimming with the kind of confidence only men who had never seen true combat could have. Spence, Toiver, and Darren were well known in these circles, their egos as inflated as their muscles. They worked out hard, but they'd never been tested. They had the kind of fitness that looked good in photos, but hadn't been put through the crucible of real combat. When Spence caught sight of Briggs, his eyes narrowed, scanning her every move with the lazy interest of someone looking for amusement. "Well, well," he muttered to the others, a sly grin spreading across his face. "New blood, or someone's mom got lost looking for the commissary?" Toiver snickered, glancing over. "Definitely logistics," he replied, casting an exaggerated glance at Briggs' faded uniform. "Look at those sleeves. Bet she files reports about push-ups instead of doing them." Darren, who had been lifting weights with more show than substance, let out a laugh, his voice dripping with condescension. "Total paper soldier vibes. Probably has a certificate for typing speed hanging in her cubicle." The 3 of them burst into laughter, each of them feeding off the other's mockery, their voices carrying across the gym with a sense of superiority. They weren't the first to judge someone like Briggs, and they wouldn't be the last. After all, who would take a woman in her 40s seriously in a place like this? Who would think that someone so seemingly ordinary had seen more than they could ever imagine? Briggs, however, remained silent. She didn't flinch, didn't react. She didn't need to prove anything to them, and she wasn't about to engage in their petty games. Instead, she set her duffel down with a soft thud, her movements controlled and deliberate. There was no need to waste energy on words when actions spoke louder. As she pulled out her hand wraps and began preparing for her workout, she moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Every loop, every adjustment was performed with practiced efficiency. No hesitation, no display of bravado, just the quiet assurance that she didn't need to announce her presence. Briggs continued to wrap her wrists, each movement deliberate and calm, the black cloth of the hand wraps folding neatly around her skin. The gym, full of the usual buzz of clanking weights and grunts of exertion, seemed distant to her, almost like a background noise. She wasn't here for any audience. Her focus was entirely on the task at hand. Literally, each loop of the wrap was applied with surgical precision, muscle memory guiding her through the routine. There was no need for distraction, no need for anyone's approval. But as she worked, the compression sleeve on her forearm shifted slightly, revealing just enough of what lay beneath. A patch of skin, faintly scarred, marked with vertical lines that caught the light in a way that drew the eye. They were too precise to be random, too clean to be natural. The lines weren't tattoos, nor were they the result of any injury. They looked deliberate, intentional. Spence, who had been eyeing her from the corner of his eye, noticed first. His gaze sharpened as he caught the movement. At first, he wasn't sure what he was seeing, just a flash of skin, too quick to fully comprehend. But as the compression sleeve shifted again, the lines became clearer. The marks weren't just some odd quirk. They were too precise, too deliberate. His curiosity peaked, and his grin faded slightly. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, his voice filled with mockery. But there was something different now, an uncertainty laced in his words. "What's with the wrist art?" Briggs didn't look up. She didn't need to. Her eyes remained steady on her work, wrapping the second wrist with the same quiet determination. The mockery in Spence's voice didn't rattle her. She wasn't here for their validation. She wasn't here for any of this. But as the room continued to buzz with the sounds of their laughter, something shifted. The tension in the air grew thicker. There was an underlying unease that none of the men could name yet. Toever stepped forward, eyes narrowed now, scrutinizing the lines on her wrist. "Kill count," he muttered. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow, lacking the bravado they had held just moments earlier. The joke didn't land like it should have. It didn't carry the same weight of mockery it once had. Briggs finished adjusting her wraps, stood, and without a single glance at the men who had once laughed at her, she turned toward the sparring mats, her movements still smooth and controlled. Her silence spoke volumes. She didn't need to explain herself, but for the first time, the room was no longer filled with laughter. Now, it was filled with questions. The gym was alive with activity, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air was heavier now, filled with an unspoken tension that hadn't been there before. As Briggs moved toward the sparring mats, the men who had mocked her moments earlier watched in silence. She wasn't walking like someone ready to back down or retreat. She was walking like someone who had already won. The sparring area, marked off by regulation mats, sat at the center of the gym, a place where soldiers settled differences with more than just words. It was a space where egos were tested and reputations were earned or shattered. Briggs, however, wasn't here for reputation. She was here to teach a lesson, one that would cost more than a few bruises to learn. Spence, still recovering from the shock of her wrist marks, exchanged a glance with Toever. There was hesitation in his eyes now, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. The group had already laughed at her, dismissed her, and they weren't about to let one woman make a mockery of them. He was determined to prove her wrong, to show her that she didn't belong in this gym. After all, he'd been sparring for years. He was young, in the prime of his physical strength, and he had the kind of fitness that looked good on Instagram. He stepped onto the mats first, bouncing lightly on his feet, his hands raised in an exaggerated boxing stance. "Hope you're ready, Grandma," he said, his grin returning, though it was less confident now. "We'll go easy on you." Briggs didn't respond. Her gaze was steady calm, like someone who had seen this all before. She wasn't concerned with his bravado, nor did she care about his words. Her movements were fluid, controlled, like water flowing over rocks, gentle but unyielding. She wasn't here to impress him. She was here to teach him humility. The tension in the air was palpable as Spence threw the first punch, his fist cutting through the air with speed and force. He was quick, but Briggs was quicker. She tracked his movements with a focused intensity, her body anticipating his every move. Spence's eyes narrowed as he saw her shift, positioning herself in a way that he didn't expect. Before he could even react, she was there, moving with the ease and precision of someone who had spent years perfecting every step, every maneuver. With a quick turn of her body, she used his own momentum against him, sending him hurtling through the air, crashing onto the mat with a thud that echoed through the gym. The sound of his impact was sharp, but the silence that followed was even sharper. The room had gone still, all eyes now on Briggs. Spence lay there, stunned, trying to comprehend what had just happened. His confidence had shattered, his ego bruised. He wasn't laughing now. He wasn't grinning either. Briggs stood over him, her posture relaxed, but her eyes locked onto his with a quiet challenge that needed no words. Spence lay on the mat, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The air seemed to freeze around him as he fought to breathe, his body still trying to adjust after being so easily thrown to the ground. His mind raced. He'd been taken down so quickly, so effortlessly, that for a moment, he couldn't even recall how it had happened. 1 second, he was charging in with full confidence, and the next, he was flat on his back, wind knocked out of him. Briggs, standing just a few feet away, didn't offer a hand to help him up. She didn't say anything, either. She simply waited, poised, her eyes steady and calculating. It was clear now. This wasn't a woman to be underestimated. This wasn't some office clerk with a certificate for typing speed. This was a warrior, calm in the chaos, precise in her movements. Spence slowly got to his feet, his shoulders aching from the fall. He winced but tried to mask it with a forced grin. The laughter that had once come so easily to him was gone now, replaced by uncertainty. He wasn't about to let this go. He had to prove something. Not just to Briggs, but to himself. "All right, Grandma," Spence muttered under his breath, his voice rough but determined. "Let's see what you've really got." This time, he was more cautious. He moved with more thought, his feet lighter, his stance more guarded. He circled her, trying to read her movements, searching for any sign of weakness. He was faster now, more controlled, but Briggs was already several steps ahead. Her body remained still, waiting, watching, her eyes locked on him like a hawk waiting for its prey to make the wrong move. And then it came. Spence lunged, a quick jab aimed at her midsection, trying to catch her off guard. But Briggs was already shifting. She stepped aside with a fluid motion, using his momentum to her advantage. Before he could react, she hooked his leg with hers, sending him sprawling again. This time, directly onto his back with a controlled fall. He hit the mat with a resounding slap, the air once again forced out of his lungs. Briggs stood over him, her knee pressing lightly on his chest. Her hand twisted his wrist at an angle that made his shoulder protest in sharp pain. "Tap," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. Spence slapped the mat 3 times in quick succession, the sound loud in the stillness that had descended over the gym. Briggs immediately released him, stepping back with the same calm precision she had shown the entire time. Spence sat up slowly, cradling his shoulder, the reality of what had just happened settling in. This wasn't luck. This wasn't some beginner's mistake. This was skill, experience that could only be gained through real battle. He hadn't just been beaten. He'd been dismantled. The room, which had once been filled with easy chatter and mockery, was now quiet. Too quiet. No one was laughing anymore. The gym had gone completely still, the sound of weights clanking and feet shuffling replaced by a heavy silence. Spence, still on the mat, rubbed his shoulder, trying to comprehend how he had been taken down so effortlessly. The other 2 soldiers, Toiver and Darren, stood nearby, their earlier confidence now replaced by something less certain. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected to be so thoroughly outclassed by someone who, just moments before, had seemed so ordinary. Briggs stood quietly, adjusting the wraps on her wrists, completely unfazed by the attention. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone, least of all these 3. She had done what she came for, to remind them that appearances meant little when it came to real experience. But just as the air in the gym seemed to hang heavier, the door to the gym opened and Major Kendall Hayes stepped in. At 54, he moved with the kind of deliberate efficiency that came from decades of military service, the years of experience visible in every step. His uniform was pressed, but not in the meticulous, ceremonial way you'd expect from someone on parade duty. Instead, it was functional. A uniform worn not to impress but to serve. Hayes paused just inside the door, his trained eyes scanning the room. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. It wasn't the usual buzz of soldiers getting in their morning workout. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, and it wasn't just the sparring match between Briggs and Spence. The gym was quieter than it had been moments before. It wasn't just the soldiers' movements that had slowed. It was their very presence that had changed. His gaze landed on Briggs, still on the mat, finishing her wrist adjustments. He studied her for a moment, No visible judgment, no surprise. Just an intense, assessing look that spoke of understanding far deeper than the surface level. Hayes was no stranger to soldiers like her. He had seen the marks before, though never in public. Never in a place like this. He walked over to Sergeant Delaney, who was standing near the mat, his clipboard in hand. Delaney looked up at Hayes, his expression somewhat puzzled, clearly still processing what had just happened. "What's the situation here, Sergeant?" Hayes asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. Delaney glanced at the sparring roster. "Unexpected addition to the roster," he said. "Woman signed herself in. Said she was cleared." Hayes glanced at the name on the list. His expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted as he looked back at Briggs. There was no mistaking it now. This was no ordinary soldier. The woman on the mat had a history that none of them could possibly understand. Major Hayes didn't need to say much for the room to fall completely silent. His presence alone commanded attention, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. As he looked back at Briggs, still sitting calmly on the mat, the soldiers, Spence, Toever, and Darren, finally seemed to understand that they were in the presence of someone who had earned every bit of their respect. No one had been laughing now. No one was making any more jokes. Hayes took a slow breath before speaking again. His gaze flickered toward Spence, whose cocky grin had faded into something far more subdued. Toever and Darren stood motionless, their earlier bravado long gone. They were no longer the loud, confident men they had been when Briggs first walked into the gym. Now, they were just soldiers, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. "You boys have any idea what you're looking at?" Hayes asked, his voice measured, but the weight of the question was undeniable. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a challenge they hadn't expected. Toever blinked, his expression shifting from smug confidence to confusion. "What, like fake war paint?" he mumbled, but there was no conviction in his words. He wasn't sure if he was still playing the game they had started, or if he was seeing things for what they really were. Spence, trying to regain some sense of control, shifted uncomfortably on the mat, his face pale. What is it, sir?" he asked, the bravado in his voice almost completely gone. The tone was different now, small, unsure. Darren, who had been the most vocal earlier, looked down at his boots, suddenly too aware of the insignificance of their earlier mockery. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by the silent weight of understanding. They hadn't just misjudged Briggs. They had missed the entire point. They had underestimated the one soldier who wasn't there to prove anything to them, but simply to remind them of one thing: never assume. Hayes turned back to Briggs, whose calm demeanor hadn't wavered throughout the entire exchange. "Sergeant Briggs," Hayes said, his voice carrying a note of professional respect. She looked up at him for the first time, a brief acknowledgement of his presence, before returning to her task of packing up her duffel bag. "Still sharp," Hayes commented, his voice almost conversational, as if the exchange on the mat hadn't even been a challenge. For Briggs, it was just another day. For the three soldiers, however, it was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. Briggs finished packing her duffel bag, the soft sound of fabric zipping up filling the silence that had stretched across the gym. She didn't rush, taking her time as if the entire room wasn't watching her every move. There was no tension in her posture now, no trace of the sparring match that had just unfolded. To her, it was simply another routine, another day of reminding the world that appearances meant little when it came to real strength. Spence, Toever, and Darren stood in silence, their thoughts racing, the reality of what had just happened sinking in deeper with each passing second. They had walked into the gym that morning thinking they knew everything they needed to about Briggs. She was just another desk soldier, out of her league. Now, they stood on the edge of a lesson that would change their perception of every person they met moving forward. Hayes glanced over at them, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said much during the sparring match, but now his words were sharper, carrying the weight of someone who had seen the mistakes the soldiers had made. "You're going to remember this morning for a long time," he said, his voice steady but firm. "The question is whether you're going to learn from it or just file it away as an embarrassing story to tell your friends." The words landed heavily in the room. It wasn't just the lesson of the sparring match. No, it was the realization that they had just misjudged someone based on their own narrow assumptions. And now, it was their choice whether they would carry that lesson with them or let it fade away with time. Briggs stood up, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't look at any of them. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. She had delivered her lesson. How they chose to receive it was up to them. As she walked toward the door, the gym's atmosphere shifted again. It wasn't the same place anymore. It wasn't the same room where mockery and arrogance had filled the air just a short time ago. Now, there was a newfound respect, though it was unspoken. The men who had laughed at her, dismissed her, now stood there, their eyes following her departure with a mixture of awe and humility. The door closed behind Briggs with a soft hiss, and the room remained still, caught in the silence of realization. The world outside the gym hadn't changed, but inside, something had shifted forever. As the gym door softly hissed shut behind Sergeant Briggs, the room remained unervingly still. The echoes of her steps faded, but the impact of what had just unfolded hung heavily in the air. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that spoke of lessons learned. Not from books, not from manuals, but from real experience. Now, as the hum of the gym returned to life, there was no laughter. No one made jokes. There was only reflection. Spence, Toiver, and Darren stood in place, each of them silently processing what had just happened. They had learned something that couldn't be taught in any classroom or through any amount of training. They had learned a lesson about humility, respect, and the dangers of making assumptions based on surface-level impressions. But what about you, the viewer? Have you ever met someone you completely misjudged? Someone who, at first glance, seemed to be something entirely different from what they really were? How many times have you looked at a person, judged them by their appearance, and completely overlooked their true strength or capability? The truth is, we all do it. Make assumptions, label others without knowing their full story. The story of Sergeant Briggs is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always obvious. It isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's quiet, reserved, and unassuming. Sometimes, the people who seem the least likely to surprise you are the ones who have the most to teach. We challenge you to think about your own life. How many times have you been guilty of judging others based on appearances? How many times have you underestimated someone who was quietly capable of far more than you ever imagined? Now, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Has there ever been a time when you misjudged someone? How did it change the way you saw them? And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Remember, respect is earned, not given. The next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations, think twice before making assumptions. They may just have a story to tell that will change your perspective forever. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.